A few years ago, I met Alex Snodgrass at a local woodworking show, and he showed me how he could make one of these little bandsaw reindeer in just under a minute. Now that was super impressive, so I wanted to see if I could take his design and make it just a little bit more colorful. So here are a few designs I came up with, and let me show you how I made each one. Now here's the first reindeer. This thing is made just completely out of one piece of solid hardwood. And I wanted to create a control piece so you can kind of get an idea that it still looks great in one solid color, but it'd be nice if we could add a little coloration to it. Now the second one I made is actually a piece of pine. I found a piece of pine that had some nice grain structure in it, and I thought this right here would stand out a lot. So when I cut it into the reindeer, you can see how the grain structure not only has a normal spiral to it, but it kind of curves a little bit as well because of the actual curves in the reindeer. This right here makes this setup really pop. Now compared to the original, you can see that they both look really good, but I believe that the one with the grain structure can stand out just a little bit more from a distance. Now the next two deer were actually made out of some thin pieces of cedar. Now a friend gave me this cedar, and if you look at it, it has definitely some light and dark coloration into it, and a little bit of kind of curves and spirals within itself, like so. And so I figured it'd be a great idea to mix and mingle some of these together, glue them together in a pattern similar to that, and then cut out the reindeer. And the unique grain structure of that cedar made these two reindeer really stand out. Now if you look at this design here, I did the layer of the wood front to back, which gave me several layers this way, but also some of that intermingling of the curves of the grain kind of stands out in some other shapes as well. And this deer actually did the wood side to side, and that kind of gives it a little bit more bold down the center and a little bit more colors on the sides. Either way, they look awesome. Now if by chance you don't have the thin pieces of wood that you can glue together, that's okay. Try and find some multicolored wood. For example, this is Paduke. And because it is two different colors here, a lot of people might throw this out or consider it just not usable. But actually I think that two-tone there really stands out. So let me show you the deer for this one. And here's the reindeer from the Paduke. If you notice, it has a little more red on this side, and it's almost white on that side. But right down the center, I have a two-tone look here, and I think it looks really cool. So if by chance you don't have thin wood that you can layer together, find some that's a little bit mismatched, and it can look really cool. Now for the next deer, I actually took some super jumbo craft sticks, and I painted one side of them red and one side of them black. And then I glued them all together with just some wood glue, making sure that all the red sides were touching and all the black sides were touching to try and get as much of that color thickness as possible. Now once I had it all glued together, took it over to the table saw and just kind of squared everything up and cut it to size. And once cut out, that reindeer really looked neat. The different colors and different layering really makes it stand out from a lot of other reindeer you might have seen before. Now this wasn't a hard design to cut out. It's very similar to the other deer that we cut out earlier, but it did require a little additional sanding on the front and back, because when we cut everything out, sometimes it was a little bit odd, like on the back, it was a little discolored with the black, and I didn't want to look like he had poo on his back end, so I had to sand that down a little bit. And on the front, it was a little discoloration with the red, but that's okay, I sanded that a little bit, so that's why these are a little bit more plain than the rest of the deer. But overall, it looks really cool, and I hope you like it. Now, if you don't have the craft sticks or just don't have the time to paint it and glue everything together and wait, you might want to consider some plywood. I believe this was pine, but hardwood should work as well. But I'd suggest having the ones with multiple layers in the middle. It just gives it a little bit more strength. And here is your plywood reindeer. I really love the layered look, but I also like this different colors that kind of pop on the sides, because as you hit the different layers, they give just different thicknesses and different colorations. And I think that looks great as well. And here's one more look at the different colorations. Now, if you've never made one of these little bandsaw reindeer, let me give you a few tips that'll help you with the process. Now, the first thing you're going to need is a bandsaw. Now, this is a big 14-inch bandsaw, and you don't have to have one this big. A lot of people have these smaller bench-type bandsaws, and you should be able to get away making a smaller reindeer with that type. Now, I prefer the bigger one like this just because you have more power in the motor. For example, this right here is very hard to stop whenever the blade is moving. On my smaller benchtop one, I actually stalled the motor several times, and the blade that is, trying to cut through some of these pieces of wood. So that's why I'd suggest the bigger one if you have it. If not, just go real slow with the smaller bandsaw and it might work well for you. Now, some of you might have scroll saws, but a lot of time you're limited on the height, specifically these smaller scroll saws, and you might not be able to get the edge cut that you need for this reindeer. That is why I suggest using a bandsaw. Now, some of you might be thinking, what about a jigsaw? Well, I have two good reasons why you should not use a jigsaw for this. One, having your hands anywhere close to this saw is just extremely dangerous because it's a little bit hard to control. And on top of that, this blade here has a tendency to flex a lot whenever you're making your curved cuts, which will just make the deer look really weird. To cut out one of these bandsaws, it's best to have a template to do this. Now, if you look back at the original video I showed you, Alex didn't need one of those templates because he's been cutting these out for many years and can do it freehand with hardly any thought process. I mean, literally in under a minute. It's just amazing. So I went back and tried to get some freeze frames of it, and then I tried to hand sketch a few things, and well, it didn't come out all that great. So I was able to get on SketchUp, and I was able to make a nice little template here that I want to give to you. Now keep watching and I'll show you just how to get these for free. Now I made these templates small enough that you can use a lot of scrap lumber for this, as long as it's about 3/4 of an inch thick. Then we want to take some scissors and go along the outside edges of this to cut it out. Once you have the template cut out, we need to find a nice long straight edge. Right here on my mat will work, but you can use anything as long as it's nice and sharp. Then we want to line your template, the line that runs down the middle here, on one edge on that corner and right here on the other, because we want to make sure we get a nice crease right along the center edge. And once you have it, just carefully start making that crease, because you want to be real precise on this so it doesn't mess up the other cuts. Now once you have your template cut and folded, take that scrap piece of wood that you're going to be using, and we just want to do a temporary fit on it, and just to make sure everything lines up nice and square. If it doesn't, this is a good time to go back and square up your piece of wood, because you want it to be nice and square as possible, otherwise it could mess up that cut later. Now once your template and your wood is ready, we want to use some stick glue to actually adhere these two together. Now I know not everybody has stick glue, but I strongly suggest this because once you put it on there, it's really easy to position a paper in place, and if by chance it's not exactly right, you can always gently peel it back off and replace it into position. Another option might be some spray-on adhesive, but I found that this stuff kind of gets sticky just everywhere, and it's a little bit harder to actually apply your template without messing it up. So you can use it, just if you do, be very careful. Now once you have the template glued on, it's time to cut it out. But I have to warn you, bandsaws are very dangerous. Even though this doesn't sound like a circular saw or a table saw, these blades are still moving very fast and can cut you open without any warning. So make sure whenever you're making your cuts, your hands are away from the front of that blade, and just be very cautious doing it. Now before we make our first cut, we need to make sure that our bandsaw is set up correctly. And to do that, I like the Alex Snodgrass method. Now of course I could show you how to do all this, but that would be a whole nother video, and I don't want to bore you through that right now. So if by chance you don't know how to do that, I'd suggest looking on YouTube for Alex Snodgrass. That's Alex Snodgrass, and you'll see several videos of him showing you just exactly how to set up your bandsaw as best as possible so your cuts are as straight as possible. Now when you go to make your cuts, I strongly suggest cutting out the side piece first, not the tall piece, but the skinny side first. And we're going to carefully follow the best we can along those marks, cutting out, trying to keep a full side over here if possible. Now this is a craft stick one I cut earlier. I'm going to try and assemble this back together to show you exactly how I cut this. I first cut out the side, like I was saying to do with this one, and that allowed me to have a little extra on the end on this side here and on this side over here. And one of these sides, it may not always be exactly right. And as you can see, I taped it back together. I literally went back and taped everything together so that I can have a nice grip on the sides so I can make these tall cuts. Now when you go to make these side cuts, your fingers could be really close to the blade because as you can see, these are really close to the edge here. Now whenever you're doing this, trying to keep your fingers as far away from that blade as possible because just one little slip and you could cut your finger really bad. Now after you cut the short side and the long side, you can start peeling everything apart. And once you do, you should come up with a finished product. Now when you're taping up your pieces, I strongly suggest using some clear tape. It just makes it a lot easier to see the lines. Now once you have your reindeer cut out, don't be surprised if you need to do a bunch of sanding, because especially if this is your first try, you're going to have a bunch of little marks from the blades that just doesn't look right. So just very gently go over as much as possible. Try and remove any excess paper or tape you might have on there as well. And just be gentle, trying to get to look as best as possible. But don't be surprised if there's still a few little marks here and there that are just hard to get to. That's okay, it gives it a little character. Now if by chance you do have one of these big bandsaws, not only can you cut out one of these little small reindeer, you can cut out one of these large ones as well. Now back to those templates I mentioned earlier. Of course, I'm going to give you these for free, but I'm going to actually give you a set of 4 on each page for the small one, and I'm going to include the template for the larger one as well. There's 2 on each page, so hopefully you can cut out a bunch of these really easily. Now if you're interested in these, I'll put a link in the description. Make sure you check that out. Now if you enjoyed this bandsaw project, I have a few other in the works, so make sure you keep a lookout for those.